Hi, I've just finished making one of these handy little wooden scoops, and I'd like to do another one so you can see how I made it. They can be done out of any hardwoods. Close grained is probably better. They can be used to measure dry goods like sugar, flour, rice in the kitchen. Any size or shape that fits your needs will work. At the end, I'll even show you how to calibrate one to see how much it holds. Let's get started. So our first step is to get our centers on our blank, which happens to be a 2x2 by 6 inches long. You have two choices. You can either very carefully go from corner to corner, strike your lines. And since our project is going to be nearly the diameter of the width of this block, we want to do this pretty carefully. The second way to do it is to use a center finder. And it's probably the easiest. But when we do this, we want to make sure we go around all four directions. And a lot of blanks aren't cut perfectly straight, as you'll see here. And so that gives us a center mark to go back and do our center punching on. So we'll just go on around this one 4 times, and then take our center punch. And it's easier to come in from the side and find the center, make an indent, come from the center, make an indent, so that you have them in the direct center of that mark. With our blank marked, now I'm going to insert a Steb Center into the headstock spindle and center it on one of those dimples, bring up the tailstock, lock it down, and then use the spindle crank to secure us in the other end. And then with this blank set diagonally, we're going to bring up our tool rest to roughly 1/4 inch away from the piece of wood. And of course, we always rotate the wood once we've mounted it to make sure it doesn't hit the tool rest. So next we're going to lay out our design on here, and the first item is going to be our cup, which we're going to mark to about 2 inches. 6 inches about the max size wood you want to have for this project. So using that size, 2 inches in, and then I'm going to use a saddle square and just mark that around the blank. And once we get that marked, then we're going to leave this portion of our blank square, and we're going to round down this portion. I'm going to mark the solid part inside of here. We see the shadow here of the square wood, and down in here is solid wood, and that's what we're going to turn it down to. So I'll be using a spindle roughing gouge and anchoring it on the tool rest, dropping the handle, and then coming in and starting to round that out. And I want to round it out until I get down to that pencil mark I left on it. Then I can come back here and round this out to try to be parallel with this. And that's easiest by putting your finger in the back of the tool rest, pinching the tool, and not letting it go in any further than you want it to. We hear a little rattle there, so we know there are a few little corners left. And that should about do it. Okay, next we're going to mark off the other end, and that's going to be for our tenon, because we're going to mount this in a chuck, and so we need a tenon. And again, I'll use the saddle square to mark that off. This normally should be 1/4 to 3/8 inch long. I'm marking this to approximately the 3/8, and I'm just using it as a guide. Depending on the day, I may decide to cut it short or long. Turn the lathe back on, turn it to make sure it's clearing the tool rest. I'm going to use a thin parting tool to just score this. And then I'm going to come back with either a wider parting tool or a Bedan, which I'm using in this case. I'm going to use this in a dovetail chuck, so I'm going to form a dovetail. And I need approximately 1 7/8, which I'm right at for my diameter. And I've got my dovetail on there. And I think this is just a little bit deep, so I'm going to shorten that up just a smidge. And the part I took off will fit inside the chuck just fine. There's two things we want to really pay attention to, and that is the corner. This corner down here has to be perfectly clean. So where this piece of wood hits this piece, this has to be totally 90 degrees to the surface, and it has to have a sharp corner down there for your chuck jaws to go, or it won't fit properly and it won't be safe to run. So we want to make sure that this surface down here sits very flat on this surface here with no space in between. If you can get a piece of paper in between the wood and the jaws, they need to be recut. And to do that, using a spindle detail gouge, I would come in like such. And I'd also go down the dovetail and into the backing. And then I'm pretty well assured that I've got the surfaces I need. So let's remove our blank and move our tailstock out of the way. And we'll use a knockout bar to take our drive center out. And mount our 4-jaw chuck. Always easier to rotate the hand wheel, and it eliminates strip threads. So with pressure against the block, putting it into the chuck, and we should be tight all the way around against these shoulders. Move up our tool rest. We're going to just shape this cylinder a little bit, and then we'll get on to hollowing. And I'm using a spindle roughing or a spindle gouge. It's not uncommon to have to redo these just slightly after chuck mounting. And now we're going to just barely start our curve at the bottom, so we know where the end of our cup is going to be. And we reposition our tail rest, or our tailstock. And since I'm going to be hollowing down the center of this, it's always a little steadier to keep the center of the post and the center of the stock. It takes a lot of the chatter out. Set our tool rest so that the tool sits dead center into that hole, and we're actually going to drill a hole using our spindle gouge. Turn the flute straight up, then rotate it 45 degrees, enter the hole, and then just push. Now I have some marks on the side of my gouge, And I'm going to, in this case, I'm going to go to my first mark. That should be about the right depth. And I'll use my depth gauge to use as a guide here, and then mark on the outside how deep that hole is. And now we're going to start hollowing with a spindle gouge. And the method is hard, end grain is very hard to cut. So what we're going to be doing is cutting side grain. We're going to be coming around inside that hole and cutting side grain. You don't want to come too far to the outside yet. That's about far enough. Now I don't want to get to the bottom of the hole. We're going to have to be removing this block to go cut a part of this shape out on a bandsaw. But to help us get it back in here to finish the rest of the project, I want to mark the number 4 jaw. And the reason we do the number 4 or the number 2, either one, is because that jaw on my chuck is very close to where my key is. So when I go to put this back in, my key can be here. I'm right on that jaw. So I'm very careful, or with a very sharp pencil, I mark down both sides of the number 4 jaw. And then I write number 4 on my stock so that I know that's where I'm going to go back to. And we'll actually be able to feel where those jaws are in. And when you mount these jaws in, you want the jaw separation to be somewhere between 1/8 and 3/16. And that's when you've got an almost perfect circle and you've got the biggest contact with the tenon. This is a big enough opening. I'm not concerned about getting a finger caught in there. If it were terribly much smaller, I would never do that. So we'll take a look and see how we're getting along. Feeling pretty good. Move up and do a little 220. Always keep the sandpaper moving, don't let it stay in one place. And then we can do the same with the outside. And we'll apply some finish to that. This happens to be an easy to use wax friction polish. You always have to shake it up good and mix the wax in with the shellac because they do separate rather quickly. Apply it by hand without the lathe running. Get your stock in there, get the finish in there, and make sure all surfaces are covered. And then we'll go to the outside. And this has the name friction polish because we want to create friction to actually dry the finish, and it'll add a little shininess to it. And you can apply a couple of coats out here because it soaks in pretty quickly. And now we're going to turn the lathe on and put a little more in here. And so you can see one of the reasons why we left a lot of material behind the cup is because we're putting quite a bit of force on this to get the friction to heat the finish up. Again, be careful of the square portion. So the reason we turned the cup first and left the square block is for stability in making this cut on the bandsaw. So I'm going to come into it and go down and then swing around, but I'm going to actually be a little short on my cut. And then I'm going to make a second pass, enter the cup the same place, and then take away more of the front until I come even with the bottom edge. All right, I've remounted my blank into the chuck on jaw number 4 as I had indicated. I wiggled it back and forth as I slowly tightened, and I could feel it go right into its previous notches and location. So now we're going to continue rounding this piece down and form a handle. And I'm going to start out using a 1/2-inch spindle gouge just to get rid of some bulk. And what I want to work on is forming the rest of this cone. Those were bevel riding cuts. And now I've got that cleared. I'm just going to work at getting rid of some stock in a hurry. I don't want to take it all the way back so I can keep some strength in this piece of wood. And I find that a Bedan is a pretty good clearing tool. You need to be thinking about the design you want in your handle. And I'll switch to a 3/8-inch spindle gouge. We'll come down here to maybe not quite 3/8 of an inch. Remember, this can be a sensitive breaking area. And then I think it looks nice to put a little bead on the end of that. Maybe around a 1/2 inch in diameter or so. Maybe a little bigger. Now if you have a 1/4-inch spindle gouge, it gets down in this corner and makes a nice clean cove, maybe a little bit easier. Form a bead here. And we can leave a little detail line in there. Finish the bead on the other side, we roll the tool over. And then we can take away some more stock quickly again. Which is why I like the Bedan a little bit better. So now we want to taper the handle up a little bit from this minimum diameter. So we're kind of making it match across the bead, be the same diameter. And I'm just kind of rough tapering this up. And we'll take some of this down. Now within the handle here, we're going to decide on where to end it and what detail we might want on the end of it. Before we get anything too low in diameter on this end, we want to go ahead and sand what we have while we're putting force on that handle. We don't want to break it off. Starting out with a little bit of 180, and then we get to 220. So once we're done with the sanding here, we're going to apply finish onto these parts of the handle. So sand that up lightly, up to 220, apply some finish on it, being careful not to put too much pressure on it. So the reason I like to put those knobs on the end are that when we part this off, we're now going to have a very small area that we need to sand and refinish. We don't know which size you might make, but I'll show how you can calibrate one, and that is take a measuring spoon, and sugar or rice would be a good choice of material. And then, as in all kitchens, you probably have some sandpaper laying around, so you can level the cup. This happens to be a tablespoon. I'll put it into the scoop, and then I'll turn the scoop. And so I would say that would be a 1 tablespoon scoop.